The next speaker is Catalin Miron. He's from Romania. He works at Microsoft on Skype. You might recognize his Twitter profile picture. It's yellow and black, and he has a hat and sunglasses. And he's been around in the React Native community for a while, making Expo apps and putting a lot of demos on GitHub of various kinds of animations and that sort of thing. Today, he's going to talk about CSS linear gradient, or just CSS gradients in general, in React Native. He actually first came on my radar a few years ago because I noticed that on his Twitter profile he worked at Hootsuite. Hootsuite is a social media kind of company where you post somewhere and schedule, and it goes to all these different social media platforms. But the reason why I noticed that is that Hootsuite is a Vancouver company, and it's right in the middle of Vancouver's best brewery district, where we have like 9 breweries within a few blocks. So it's a pretty nice place to work. So yeah, that's Catalin, and he's going to come up and talk about gradients. Let's give him a round of applause as he comes up.
Hey guys. I need to do some things. Cool. So, thanks, Brent, for the introduction. I'll be talking today about CSS gradients in React Native and how we can leverage the web gradients and make the full developer experience and increase it. As Brent said, my name is Catalin Miron. I'm the guy with the hat and the glasses. I forgot them at home, so don't worry about that. This is my Twitter handler, Miron Catalin. You can follow me, blog me, unfollow me if you already follow me. And you can say bad things on me. Or you can find more about my work on Batman Codes, which is my website. I'm currently working at Skype in the messaging team, where I'm building the cross-platform application using React, React Native, and Electron. So this is our stack. I'm also I have a bunch of stickers and other stuff, so feel free to come to me. I'll be more than pleased to give some to you. First, I'd like to start with my journey in this React and React Native ecosystem. And how I came up with the title, because there was a need in the first place. I've been doing React for more than 5 years now, and I had so much joy and fun working with it and building applications, and how the component can be reused and build a whole tree. It was insane, and the developer experience was ridiculous, and it's super nice. And writing HTML directly there was great. I was super lucky because one of my ex-colleagues went to React conference in 2015, where Facebook announced React Native, and whoever was in the audience gained access to React Native repo when it was private mode. And I got also access to it. And so after 5 months after Facebook released React Native, I was super stoked, and I built the very first React Native application, like a complete one, where I showed the actual React Native power. And I remember back then it was React Native version 0.4, and it didn't have support for Android, and there were only a couple of libraries out there, such as React Native vector icons, which I'm also using here, and that's it more or less. But then I started realizing that the community is super awesome, and I want to do more for them. And so while I was doing a React Native small application about codes, I actually found this code super nice, and it said that for the things we have to learn before we do them, we learn by doing them. And so this it's a code by Aristotle, and inspired me. And I created a series called Learning by Doing, where I'm mostly taking interactions done by great designers, published on Dribble, UI Movement, and Pinterest. And I'm trying to recreate those in React Native using animated API and other third-party libraries. During my work in this Learning by Doing series, I noticed a pattern on UI in general, and more designers were using gradients, and they were also animated those, and they created great interactions and advanced animations using gradients. And so I started to dig deeper and see how can I achieve the same thing in React Native. Before I'll go to React Native, first we need to get familiar or to get the basic understanding of how a gradient is working on web. First, I like to see how many of you are coming from a web background and wrote at least once a linear gradient on web. Whoa. Okay, and how many of you wrote at least once a gradient in React Native? Okay, not too many. I hope that after this talk you'll use it more. And it's all about the developer experience. And coming from a web background, I could see the power of React Native, React, and CSS in general. But moving to React Native was a different behavior, and I'll be talking about it in the upcoming. I like to thank Patrick Brosset for creating a tool for learning linear gradient and how it's working in CSS, and also for writing an awesome article about CSS gradients on the web, and also for giving me the rights to redistribute the work that I'll be showing you during my talk. Linear gradient, this is the current syntax which you can use on web. This method accepts two arguments. The first one is optional, and it's either an angle in degrees, units, and the second one, or you can also pass a keyword direction, which can be to bottom, to right, top, to left. And the second argument is the list of color stops, which can be infinity. How gradient is working on web? It's not pretty simple, but it's simple enough to I'll just show you the bigger picture. I'm not going to go into super deep problems, but unlike the original background image, the gradient, because gradient it's a background image on the web, it doesn't have a finite dimension. It's infinite, and so what gives the gradient? What makes the gradient visible is the gradient box, which I emphasize here in the corner, in the rectangle. And more or less, the point here is that gradient box is the visible part of the gradient image. The next one is the gradient line. The gradient line is the line that passes the center of the gradient box, along which we can distribute the color stops. In this example, I'm just using only two color stops, which are basically the start and end of the gradient line. The next one are the start and end points, the gradient line length, sorry. And you can calculate the gradient line length using that formula, where W is the width of the gradient box, H is the height of the gradient box, and A is the angle between the vertical line that passes through the center of the gradient box and the line itself. Now the start and end coordinates, it's more or less a set of coordinates, x, y coordinates, that defines where they are positioned in the system. And You can also calculate those with math formulas. I haven't added those because they require some math knowledge. But you can come afterwards and talk with me if you really want to dig deeper into this subject, like how you can calculate the x and y. And the gradient angle. The gradient angle, as I said, is like the angle formed by the vertical line that is passing the center of the gradient box and the line itself. Which is nice on CSS gradients is that if you're omitting the angle, which is the first argument of the linear gradient, the default angle is going to be 180 degrees, which is also equal to bottom keyword. 0 degrees means to top, so there is a confusion because it's like the reverse way of thinking from a human being perspective. As you can see here in this animation, from time to time, in order to create a gradient, let's say of 45 degrees, when you have on the corner you'll have a pure red in our case, and on the opposite side you'll have a pure blue. The gradient line should expand the gradient box, and this is where the magic, let's say, is happening on the web. So it's not always about placing the points at the edge of the gradient box. You always need to expand it and to properly spread the whole gradient along the gradient box. So to recap, on web, the linear gradient has, if you're not going to add the first argument to the linear gradient, is going to be 180 degrees. The 0 degrees means to top, and the gradient line from time to time had to expand out of the gradient box in order to properly spread the colors. Now the fun part, the React Native linear gradient. There is a library, Brent again did it. It's called React Native linear gradient, and nowadays it's taken by React Native community. And you can render gradients in React Native quite easily, I would say. And this is also available in Expo SDK. So if you're using Expo, you can import the linear gradient directly from Expo SDK. You don't need to eject it and link the React Native library. And I'll be using linear gradient for my upcoming slides. And how linear gradient is working on React Native in two different ways. The first one, you need to pass the start, end, and location and colors as x, y coordinates for start and end, and the colors, which is the list of the colors, and locations, which is an optional list. Otherwise, it will try to spread them equally. And the second way of rendering a linear gradient is by using use angle and the center of the gradient box, more or less. So angle center is the center of the gradient box from where you'd like to start the gradient. This was added lately, I think 1 year ago, and it's still cross-platform. So it's, as you could see, like the difference from web to React Native, it's huge. And usually on the web, you don't have to care about the x, y coordinates, and you don't need to know, hey, where I'm ending, where I'm starting, or how gradients are working in general. You just pass a linear gradient, that's the syntax, use it, and it's going to work out of the box. On React Native side, usually, I remember that whenever I was dealing with React Native gradients, I usually had to have a pen and a paper and do the math. And 100% I wasn't sure what I was doing, and definitely the output wasn't right. So it happens. So I'll be talking about my solution. Definitely is not bulletproof, but it's something that will help and increase the developer experience, especially if you're coming from a web background or you'd like to reuse other existing linear gradients on the web, because there are plenty, and also websites that provide great gradients. And I open source the React Native CSS gradient library that I'll be talking in the upcoming slides. First, if you'd like to get your hands dirty, let's say, and you want to play around with it, I expose the snack that is going to create this list with gradients, and you can see how they are actually rendered on your device. And the gradients that I'm using in this animation, in this snack, are from webgradients.com. I think that I also open sourced the scraper for it, but I don't know if someone will sue me. Yeah, I just scraped the website. How React Native CSS gradient is working is like it's exposing two different things. One is a gradient component, and the other one is the helper. The gradient component accepts a gradient, a property, which is exactly the CSS syntax as you'll use on the web, and two mandatory style properties, which are width and height, in order to determine the gradient box underneath. Or if you're not going to use the gradient, or you just want to generate your numbers, like the properties for linear gradient, I'm also exposing a helper method that accepts the gradient syntax, and you can also pass the width and the height. I'll go deeper in how generate gradient it's working. Sorry about that. So given this linear gradient of 45 degrees starting from red to blue, we are going to pass it down to the pipe. And first thing, we are going to parse it. The next one is going the output of the parser, and through do some, let's say, magic underneath. More or less, there are multiple methods that are going to calculate the properties for linear gradient, and then finally render the linear gradient using Expo. By the way, this library is super tied to Expo, so it's not going to work if you're using React Native linear gradient. I'm still working on making it happen, but feel free to use only the helper for now. First, the gradient parser. I'm using an open source package for that, built by Rafael Cariccio, and it's called Gradient Parser. And what is nice about this is based on the linear gradient method is going to expose us an object that we can iterate over it and create whatever we want with it. And in this example, we will have the type of it. We also have the orientation. Can be angular, but also units are like the turn keyword, it's also available. And there is the list of color stubs. And based on this, then the gradient generator comes into place. So gradient generator is a set of methods that is going to get that output of the gradient parser and expose a set of props available for that linear gradient understands. So in our case, this 45 degrees is going to calculate and generate the set of properties that you can find here on the screen, which are, you cannot do it properly, not even with a calculator, I think. So there are like big numbers or small numbers. And gradient helper calculates first the gradient line in order to get the start and end coordinates, because they are related to each other, and also generates the color stubs and the location for each individual color. And what is nice is that it has support for repeating linear gradient and also linear gradient as well. The gradient component, you can render a gradient in multiple ways. So the first one is the simple example here. So you have the same linear gradient, 45 degrees, starting from red to blue, and you just pass it down to the component, and this is how it's going to output it. So pretty fast. I think you don't need to care about the start and end or properties that linear gradient accepts. Or you can do fancy stuff, like this one, because in the end is like mapping through different gradients. This component actually is able to parse all the gradients which are separated by a comma, and for each one render a gradient. And how this is working, it's actually wrapping the gradients and into a view, and each particular gradient is positioned absolute on top of each other, and you'll get this effect. So the first one is the sunset, let's say, gradient, which is the first layer. The second layer are the strips to the right, and then the strips to the left. And this is the output of this, this linear gradient, and you can go infinitely. But I saw a lot of developers complaining about gradients, animation of the gradients, and so I give it this a shot, because everything is built and calculate on the JavaScript side. You can easily animate things. So in my case, I'm using a library called PopMotion, which offers you the possibility to twin or interpolate linear gradients directly without you thinking about, hey, what is the color, or what is the first color, the second color, or everything. This library will do linear gradient interpolation on the fly. And in my example, I'm twinning over 2 seconds, and from the first gradient, which is 45 degrees from yellow to purple, and interpolating it to the second gradient, which is from purple to blue. And this is how it's going to be displayed, which is pretty awesome. Definitely is not 60 FPS, sorry William for that, but I mean, as long as the JS thread is not blocked, definitely it's a chance to animate it. And by the way, this is also available via Snack by following the small link from the left bottom corner, if you'd like to see it on your real device, if it's smooth or not. But you can do multiple things with it. After William posted a video on YouTube, a follower of his was asking, hey, is this possible to create this in React Native? And yes, it's possible. And how it is this achieved is I'm using PopMotion library that is also able to create a timeline for multiple linear gradients. And so based on this timeline, I'm using gesture handler to know the position of the knob, and I'm saying, PopMotion, give me the linear gradient for that specific location, and I'm sort of animating the gradient from behind the scene. Lately, I was doing YouTube video series, and I was animating gradients based on a state. And I'm also doing an SVG morph here, but what we should focus on is the background, which is animated using, again, PopMotion library for that. And what's funny about it is that you can stop in between interpolations, and if you're fast enough, you can click or press on the screen fast, and you'll see that it doesn't matter, you don't have to actually start from an existing gradient, but you can also start from the interpolated gradient, which is quite awesome. What are the future steps for this library is first add radial and repeating radial gradient. And the second one is add support for animations using reanimated, because again, in order to have 60 FPS or smooth animations, you need to move to the native driver, to the native side, because there is no way of you just showing a gradient in your application. You're definitely going to fetch some things or block the JS thread, right? And as a proof of concept, I already have the code for it, but as a proof of concept, maybe I'll just publish it. I'm trying to use SVG and pattern for repeating linear gradients. And for that, I had to use the linear gradient from SVG, which is also super nice because it's exposed in Expo. And The problem with gradients in SVG is that they don't have fully support for alpha. So if you're trying to do, I don't know, a line that is repeating infinitely, you need to ensure that the corners of the box are fully, they have opacity 100%. So that's it. I hope that you find me on Twitter. Follow me, and if you'd like to find more about this project, I'll definitely be posting there more, so feel free to follow me. Again, block me if you'd like. You can also check my website, and yeah, that was my talk about gradients, and I hope that from now on, at least a couple of you will use more gradients in React Native and do make awesome applications. Thank you so much.